Greetings, my friends. I don't have any time to fool around in this program because the accounts that I have here are quite long and take up all the time. First is a history of Constantine the Great by Dean Dudley, and second is the writing of Lactantius, who was Constantine's spiritual director when he was a youth. Lactantius was a convert to Christianity, and in this second half of the program, he talks about how the emperors who were against Christianity finally got the punishment that they had deserved because they persecuted Christos and his people. And I'm afraid that's about all the time I have for preamble. I would suggest if you want to find more, there's a great big internet out there, or you can refer to my earlier production on the life of Constantine. You are now experiencing Jackson Snyder Presents, sponsored by the Vero Essene Yahad and Hebrew Nation Radio, veroyahad@gmail.com.
Life of Constantine. Constantine the Great, born 82-74, was named Constantine Caius Flavius Valerius Aurelius Claudius. His father was Constantine Chlorus, and the mother his wife Helena. Being the eldest son, Constantine, soon after the death of his father in 306, was proclaimed emperor by the troops, and in 307 married Fausta, the daughter of Maximian. But Eusebius says that God, the supreme governor of the world, by his own will, appointed Constantine to be prince and sovereign. It is my intention, continues Eusebius, to pass over very many of the deeds of this thrice-blessed prince, as, for example, his conflicts and engagements in the field, and his triumphs, and to speak and write of those circumstances only which were fair to his religious character. The father of Constantine had 3 colleagues in government, Diocletian, Maximian, and Galerius, all of whom persecuted the Christians, but he was the friend of the Christians' God and devoted to the love of Christ. Constantine, soon after coming into power, resolved to destroy his colleague Maxentius, who adhered to the old idolatry, but he felt the need of some more powerful aid than his army, especially on account of the wicked and magical enchantments which were so diligently practiced by this tyrant. Therefore he began to seek for divine assistance. What particularly confirmed him in this course was the recollection that his father, who had opposed the persecuting spirit of his colleagues and honored the one supreme God during his whole life, had found him to be the savior and protector of the empire. Accordingly, says Eusebius, he called on him with earnest prayer and supplication that he would reveal to him who he was and stretch forth his right hand to help him in his present difficulties. And while he was thus praying with fervent entreaty, a most marvelous sign appeared to him from heaven, the account of which it might have been difficult to receive with credit had it been related by any other person. But since the victorious emperor himself long afterward declared it to the writer of this history, when he was honored with his acquaintance in society, and confirmed his statement by an oath, who could hesitate to credit the relation, especially since the testimony of after time has established its truth? He said that about midday, when the sun was beginning to decline, he saw with his own eyes the trophy of a cross of light in the heavens above the sun, and bearing the inscription, In hoc signo vinces. Under this sign thou shalt conquer. At the sight he himself was struck with amazement, and his whole army also, which happened to be following him on some expedition, and witnessed this miracle. He moreover said that he doubted within himself what the import of this apparition could be. And while he continued to ponder and reason on its meaning, night imperceptibly drew on, and in his sleep the Christ of God appeared to him with the same sign which he had seen in the heavens, and commanded him to procure a standard made in the likeness of that sign, and to use it as a safeguard in all engagements with his enemies. At dawn he set his artificers to work, and had the signal made and beautified with gold and gems. The Romans now call it the labarum. It was the following form: a long spear overlaid with gold, crossed by a piece laid over it. On the top all was a crown, formed of gold and jewels interwoven, woven, on which were placed two letters indicating the name of Christ, the Greek letter rho being intersected by chi exactly in its center. From the transverse piece, which crossed the spear, was suspended a banner of purple cloth covered with profuse embroidery of bright jewels and gold. It was of square form, and over it, beneath the cross, was placed a golden half-length picture of the emperor and his children. This standard he ordered to be carried at the head of all his armies. Eusebius often calls it the saving signal, the salutary signal, the salutary trophy, etc. And he moreover says the emperor told him that none of those who bore this standard ever received a wound. All the enemy's darts would stick in the spear and not touch the bearer. It is singular that Eusebius seems to believe all the miracles Constantine ever narrated, and they were numerous. It is said in Mosheim's ecclesiastical history that Eusebius was probably mistaken in regard to the emperor's vision being early seen by him, because the sign of the cross had long been used by the Christians, and it is more reasonable to suppose that Constantine only dreamed that he saw it in the heavens, as he described with the inscription about conquering. Eusebius is sometimes blamed for his adulation of this hero. In one place he says, God himself was present to aid him and all through his reign, holding him up to the human race as an exemplary pattern of godliness. The first tyrant to be destroyed was Lactantius, who had been exceedingly wicked, but his crowning point was having recourse to sorcery. When this colleague was overthrown, Constantine sang, "Who is like thee, O Yahweh, among the gods?" Then the victor set up his statue in Rome, holding in his hand the labarum, with this inscription engraved upon it: "By virtue of this salutary sign, which is the true symbol of valor, I have preserved and liberated your city from the yoke of tyranny." The Christian ministers at Rome were treated with great distinction, and all who had been imprisoned or banished were released or recalled. Costly offerings were made to the churches, and the poor were relieved, even from the emperor's private funds. The next tyrant to be destroyed for his crimes and impiety was Maximian, who was detected in a treasonable conspiracy, and after him others of the same family, all their intentions being miraculously revealed by God through visions to his servant, for he frequently vouchsafed to him manifestations of himself, the divine presence appearing to him in a most marvelous manner, and giving to him many intimations of future events. The third tyrant was Licinius, who had married the sister of Constantine. This colleague also employed himself in machinations against his superior, and resolved at last to carry arms against God himself, whose worshipper he knew the emperor to be. Licinius had forbidden women to receive instruction from the bishops or even visit the churches with men, directing the appointment of females to be the teachers of their own sex, and devised other means for effecting the ruin of the churches. The fourth tyrant, Galerius Valerius, ruler of the eastern provinces, who stood in the way of Constantine, had a fatal disease overtake him as a judgment from God, and he was loaded with an enormous quantity of fat from gluttony. A vast number of worms swarmed in him because he had persecuted Christians and engaged in battle relying upon demons, whom he worshipped as gods. Maximine and his children were destroyed, AD 313, by Licinius. Licinius, after some years of peaceful rule in Thrace, Asia Minor, Syria, and Egypt, became engaged in other conflicts with Constantine, and being taken prisoner, was put to death by his conqueror, together with his supporters. Then Constantine adopted the title of Victor, and so governed the Roman Empire alone. The exiled and enslaved martyrs were released, the confessors honored, and the confiscated estates restored to the proper owners or heirs. Laws were promulgated forbidding anyone to erect images or practice divination or offer sacrifices in any way in their private houses houses. Churches were ordered to be built, the old ones to be repaired and enlarged. At this time, the heathen temples were not closed or suppressed. Great dissensions had arisen in the Church of Egypt about the nature of Christ, and the time to celebrate Passover, by which Constantine was much troubled. He therefore ordered a convention to be held at Nicaea in Bithynia, to which bishops were invited from all parts of the world, hoping that harmony might be the result from the decision of such a universal assembly of the chief Christians of the world. After these questions had been decided, the emperor directed his attention to building a great church at Jerusalem, on the spot where it was supposed the Holy Sepulchre had been discovered. The old cave was cleared of rubbish, and the most magnificent church in the world erected over it. Helena Augusta, Constantine's aged mother, visited Palestine and built a church at Bethlehem, and another on the Mount of Olives. She gave many presents to the poor, released prisoners, did many acts of kindness, mingling with the ordinary worshippers in modest attire, and exhibited a true Christian spirit. She died in her 80th year in presence of the emperor. Her likeness was impressed on golden coins. Now at last Constantine began to abolish idolatry at Constantinople, and to build churches there, and in Nicomedia, etc. And his command, the heathen temples and images were everywhere destroyed. In all his orders respecting church affairs, he acted like an ancient pope. Heresies were cursed and condemned, and heretics deprived of the right of holding meetings, and their houses of prayer were bestowed on the Catholic Church. Their books he ordered to be sought for and destroyed. Constantine had his likeness represented on golden coins, with the eyes uplifted in the attitude of prayer. And our present legal institution of Sunday was established by this man's authority. He enjoined on all the subjects of the Roman Empire to observe the Lord's Day as a day of rest. This decree for the general observance of Sunday appears to have been issued about AD 321, before which time both the old and new Sabbaths were observed by Christians. Gibbons says he's called the Lord's Day Dia Solis, that is, the day of the sun, or Sun's Day. This day, he said, should be regarded as a special occasion for prayer, and he gave his soldiers the following form of prayer to use. We acknowledge thee, the only God. We own thee as our King, and implore thy succor. By thy favor we have gotten the victory. Through thee we are mightier than our enemies. We render thanks for thy past benefits, and trust thee for future blessings. Together we pray to thee, and beseech thee long to preserve to us safe and triumphant our Emperor Constantine and his pious sons. He encouraged celibacy of the old virgin stamp, having a great veneration for it. In the 30th year of his reign, his great church of the Holy Sepulchre having been founded, he wished to dedicate it in a becoming manner, and therefore he directed that the bishops who had assembled at the Synod of Tyre in Phoenicia should be conveyed from there to Jerusalem as soon as they were ready to go, and most of them went to attend the dedication. It was the greatest synod of bishops, after that of Nicaea, that had ever assembled. There were present prelates from all the Roman provinces in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Eusebius says that he was there and delivered several orations. He also shortly afterward went to Constantinople and delivered another oration in the emperor's presence. About this time, 8330, he founded Constantinople. Constantine continued to build churches and compose religious discourses up to his last days. In the 31st year of his reign, and the 63rd of his age, he fell sick, and desired the bishop where he was, in Nicomedia, to baptize him, which was done. And he thought the ceremony had the effect to purify and purge his soul from past errors. He put on white robes, refusing to wear purple any more, made some noble bequests, and died on the last day of the Feast of Pentecost, May 22, 337. His body was laid in a golden coffin in the great Church of the Apostles at Constantinople, which he had built and designed for his sepulchre. The religious belief of this wonderful man is a matter of deep interest. His theories are expressed in his own words, and his faith we may know by his deeds. In a great oration oration addressed by him to the assembly of saints, he declares that providence rules all things like fate, that justice is ever done, and that men receive here what they merit from heaven's almighty ruling hand. His precise words are, "The events which befall men are consequent upon the tenor of their lives. Pestilence, sedition, famine, and plenty are all regulated with reference to our course of life." In regard to the philosophers who search into the secrets of nature, he remarks that they often obscure the truth when the subject of their reasoning surpasses their powers. So Socrates played constantly with the subtleties of controversy, and Plato, although he was sound in that the Word or Logos is God, and also the Son of God, yet he errs by introducing a plurality of gods. Pythagoras lied when he said that his knowledge came directly as a revelation from God, for he received it from the Egyptian priests. The soul of man is eternal, says Constantine, but all things which had a beginning must have an end. The coming of Christ, he asserts, was predicted by the prophets, the sibyls, and sublime poets. Even Virgil refers to the Christians, where he sings, "Behold anew, a heaven-born race appears." And again, "Begins Sicilian muse a loftier strain, the voice of Cuma's oracle is heard again. See where the circling years new blessings bring, the Virgin comes, and he, the long-wished king, beneath whose reign the iron offspring ends, and golden progeny from heaven descends. His kingdom banished, virtue shall restore, and crime shall threat the guilty world no more." The emperor had a great faith in prayer. He says, "The righteous prayer is thing invincible, and no one fails to attain his object who addresses holiest supplication to God." He believed in a judgment and future punishment for the wicked. The principal faults of this founder of the Christian power in Rome were, according to Mosheim, Gibbon, and other historians, very similar to those of our English sovereign Henry VIII, founder of the Protestant ascendancy in Great Britain. He was willful, voluptuous, and self-conceited. His heart was capable of extreme cruelty, as shown by his acts towards several of his near relatives. Even a son named Crispus fell a victim to his jealous resentments. He assumed that he was born to reign and held his commission from God. The flattery of the prelates might have augmented this conceit, for it was sometimes excessively fulsome. Eusebius says that on one occasion, a Christian orator asserted in the emperor's presence that he would share the empire of heaven with Christ in the world to come. Constantine favored the Arians very much in some parts of his life under the influence of Eusebius of Nicomedia, by whom he was baptized, and other Arian courtiers. Constantine was peculiar in his dress, looks, and manners. In his latter days he had a red complexion and somewhat bloated appearance. His eyes were bright and glared like those of a lion. His neck was thick, his voice soft and gentle. The spear of the soldier was ever in his hand, and a helmet on his head, studded with jewels and bound round with the oriental diadem. He wore it on all occasions. His robe of imperial purple or scarlet was made of silk, richly embroidered with pearls and flowers, worked in gold. He took much care of his hair, at last wearing wigs of false hair of various colors. His beard was shorn like that of the early Caesars. His appetite was voracious, gluttonous. His wit was crisp and dry. He never lost his presence of mind. Gibbon says of him, "In Constantine we may contemplate a hero who so long inspired his subjects with love and his enemies with terror, degenerating into a cruel and dissolute monarch, corrupted by his fortune or raised by conquest above the necessity of dissimulation. His old age was disgraced by the vices of rapaciousness and prodigality, and he lost the esteem of his subjects." The emperor had been twice married. His first wife was Minervina, of obscure family, who bore him the son Crispus. The brothers of Constantine were Julius Constantius, Dalmatius, and Hannibalianus, this last name having no children. Gallus and Julian were sons of Julius Constantius, and Dalmatius had two sons named Dalmatius and Hannibalianus. Crispus was an amiable and accomplished youth. Eusebius, the historian, called him a brave and pious son. He had been engaged in his father's war since 17 years of age, and had the deserved esteem and admiration of the court, the army, and the people. This dangerous popularity, says Gibbon, soon excited the attention of Constantine, who both as father and as king was impatient of an equal. He was confined almost as a prisoner to his father's court, and exposed, without power of defense, to the calumny of his enemies. The emperor began to hint at suspicions of a conspiracy against his person and government. By rewards, he invited informers to accuse even his most intimate favorites. The adherents of Crispus were the victims chosen. Constantine soon ordered him to be apprehended and killed, and the only son of Constantia, the emperor's sister, in spite of her prayers and tears, shared the same fate. She did not long survive this blow, dying in 329. The church historian Eusebius, first orator at the Nicene Council, nowhere mentions these horrible scenes in his prince's life. Other writers say that Fausta was the instigator of the murder of her stepson Crispus, and they say Constantine so much repented of his cruelty that he had her killed soon after by being suffocated in a boiling hot bath. Philostorigius says that the emperor murdered 2 wives, and that his 3 sons who succeeded him were the sons of an adulteress. He declares that Fausta was innocent. Helena, the aged mother of Constantine, lamenting the fall of Crispus, soon revenged it, and Fausta was accused of adultery with a slave. Her condemnation quickly followed, although she and Constantine had been husband and wife for 20 years and had 4 daughters, 3 sons, etc. That is, Constantine, Tinus, and Constans, who became heirs to the Roman Empire. Gibbon suggests some doubt about Fausta being destroyed. She was murdered privately in the imperial palace, if at all. Chrysostom, the orator, indulges his fancy by exposing the naked empress on a desert mountain to be devoured by wild beasts. Mosheim says Constantine's life was not such as the precepts of Christianity required. He put to death his own son and his wife Fausta on a groundless suspicion, and cut off his brother-in-law Licinius and the unoffending son of Licinius, contrary to his plighted word. Nevertheless, the Greek Church has canonized him and adores the memory of Saint Constantine. After his death, the bishop, to whom his will had been entrusted for Constantius, brought out a document as the will which represented that the brothers and nephews of the late emperor had attempted to poison him, and directing that his death should be avenged upon them. Whereupon the soldiers declared they would have no sovereigns but the sons of Constantine, and Constantius, probably conniving at the crime, his 2 uncles and several cousins with some of their friends were murdered in cold blood. Constantine was not a great man in depth and penetration of intellect, but exceedingly shrewd, prompt, and energetic in all the affairs of life, and inspired by such unbounded selfish ambition that he overcame difficulties which far greater souls would have deemed insurmountable. His credulity and superstition, which arose probably from ignorance of even the first principles of natural science, were the only checks upon his evil propensities, and both the old religion and the new, as he understood them, taught that every event was a special providence, and Yahweh or some other deity was the first and only cause of all our fortunes. However, according to his plan, sovereigns were instruments to carry on the affairs of the world, so they might imitate the heavenly king, and make laws for nations, slay their subjects at pleasure, as the laws of nature do, and wield the sword and fire and every kind of vengeance against their foes without overstepping the bounds of their proper sphere. And whatever God allowed to be successful bore the stamp of his approval, inasmuch as it would not have been permitted unless it were right. He was taught by the bishops that God sent his only Son to be crucified for the benefit of mankind. Therefore, a sovereign might order his son to be sacrificed for the good and peace of society. Under the influence of such fanaticism, he perhaps committed all his bloody crimes without feeling their real enormity. But his character and influence cast a dark shade over the Christianity which he established. It is one of the most tragical facts of all history, says John Stuart Mill, that Constantine, rather than Marcus Aurelius, was the first Christian emperor. It is a bitter thought how different the Christianity of the world might have been had it been adopted as the religion of the empire under the auspices of Marcus Aurelius instead of those of Constantine. Dr. Stanley of the Episcopal Church gives some pointed finishing touches to the sketch. He says the horrors of Constantine's domestic life, which he tried in vain to conceal, occurred about the time he conquered Maxentius. When he was at Rome, an inscription was found one day over the gates of the Palatine, catching at his weak points, oriental luxury and cruelty. Saturni aurea saecula quis requirit sunt haec gemmeus sed Neroniana, which I translate, the golden times of Saturn, who'd restore. Ours shine with gems, but Nero reigns once more. Hosius, the emperor's counselor in the west, came to Rome about the time with Helena, and relieved him of his deep distress by assuring him that there are no sins so great, but in Christianity they may find forgiveness. The emperor has been charged with a great many crimes besides these which are proved. He was said to have sought absolution from pagan priests, and even had an infant sacrificed and its entrails examined at the suggestion of a Jew. Many suspicions and legends against him are quoted at length by both heathen and Christian historians, and thus ends this history.
Well, I don't even have time to tell a joke, but you're listening to Jackson Snyder Presents, and we'll be right back. Excerpts from Of the Manner in Which the Persecutors Died by Lactantius. The Lord has heard those supplications which you, my best beloved Donatus, pour forth in his presence all the day long, and the supplications of the rest of our brethren, who by a glorious confession have obtained an everlasting crown, the reward of their faith. Behold, all the adversaries are destroyed, and tranquility having been reestablished throughout the Roman Empire, the late oppressed church arises again, and the temple of God, overthrown by the hands of the wicked, is built with more glory than before. For God has raised up princes to rescind the impious and sanguinary edicts of the tyrants and provide for the welfare of mankind, so that now the cloud of past times is dispelled, and peace and serenity gladden all hearts. And after the furious whirlwind and black tempest, the heavens are now become calm, and the wished-for light has shone forth. And now God, the hearer of prayer, by his divine aid, has lifted his prostrate and afflicted servants from the ground, has brought to an end the united devices of the wicked, and wiped off the tears from the faces of those who mourned. They who insulted over the divinity lie low. They who cast down the holy temple are fallen with more tremendous ruin. And the tormentors of just men have poured out their guilty souls amidst plagues inflicted by heaven, and amidst deserved tortures. For God delayed to punish them, that by great and marvelous examples he might teach posterity that he alone is God, and that with fit vengeance he executes judgment on the proud, the impious, and the persecutors. Of the end of those men I have thought good to publish a narrative, that all who are afar off, and all who shall arise hereafter, may learn how the Almighty manifested his power and sovereign greatness in rooting out and utterly destroying the enemies of his name. And this will become evident when I relate who were the persecutors of the church from the time of its first constitution, and what were the punishments by which the divine judge, in his severity, took vengeance on them. In the latter days of the Emperor Tiberius, in the consulship of Ruberius Geminus and Fufius Geminus, and on the 10th of the calends of April, as I find it written, Jesus Christ was crucified by the Jews. After he had risen again on the third day, he gathered together his apostles, whom fear, at the time of his being laid hold on, had put to flight. And while he sojourned with them 40 days, he opened their hearts, interpreted to them the Scripture, which heretofore had been wrapped up in obscurity, ordained and fitted them for the preaching of his word and doctrine, and regulated all things concerning the institutions of the New Testament. And this having been accomplished, a cloud and whirlwind enveloped him, and caught him up from the sight of the men unto heaven. His apostles were at that time 11 in number, to whom were added Matthias, in the room of the traitor Judas, and afterwards Paul. And then were they dispersed throughout all the earth to preach the gospel, as the Lord their Master had commanded them. And during 25 years, and until the beginning of the reign of the Emperor Nero, they occupied themselves in laying the foundations of the church in every province and city. And while Nero reigned, the apostle Peter came to Rome, and through the power of God committed unto him, wrought certain miracles, and, by turning many to the true religion, built up a faithful and steadfast temple unto the Lord. When Nero heard of those things, and observed that not only in Rome, but in every other place, a great multitude revolted daily from the worship of idols, and, condemning their old ways, went over to the new religion, he, an execrable and pernicious tyrant, sprung forward to raise the heavenly temple and destroy the true faith. He it was who first persecuted the servants of God. He crucified Peter, and he slew Paul, nor did he escape with impunity, for God looked on the affliction of his people, and therefore the tyrant, bereaved of authority, and precipitated from the height of an empire, suddenly disappeared, and even the burial place of that obnoxious wild beast was nowhere to be seen. This has led some persons of extravagant imagination to suppose that, having been conveyed to a distant region, he is still reserved alive, and to him they apply the Sibylline verses concerning the fugitive, who slew his own mother, being to come from the uttermost boundaries of the earth. As if he who was the first should also be the last persecutor, and thus prove the forerunner of Antichrist. But we thought not to believe those who, affirming that the two prophets Enoch and Elias have been translated into some remote place that they might attend our Lord when he shall come to judgment, also fancy that Nero is to appear hereafter as the forerunner of the devil, when he shall come to lay waste the earth and overthrow mankind. An interval of some years from the death of Nero, there arose another tyrant, no less wicked, that is, Domitian, who, although his government was exceedingly odious, for a long time oppressed his subjects, and reigned in security, until at length he stretched forth his impious hands against the Lord. Having been instigated by evil demons to persecute the righteous people, he was then delivered under the power of his enemies, and suffered due punishment. To be murdered in his own palace was not vengeance ample enough. The very memory of his name was erased, for although he had erected many admirable edifices and rebuilt the Capitol, and left other distinguished marks of his magnificence, yet the Senate did so persecute his name as to leave no remains of his statues, or traces of the inscriptions put up in honor of him, and by most solemn and severe decrees it branded him, even after death, with perpetual infamy. Thus, the commands of the tyrant having been rescinded, the church was not only restored to her former state, but she shone forth with additional splendor, and became more and more flourishing. And in the times that followed, while many well-deserving princes guided the helm of the Roman Empire, the church suffered no violent assaults from her enemies, and she extended her hands unto the east and unto the west, insomuch that now there was not any of the most remote corner of the earth to which the divine religion had not penetrated, or any nation of manners so barbarous that did not, by being converted to the worship of God, become mild and gentle. This long peace, however, was afterwards interrupted. Decius appeared in the world, an accursed wild beast, to afflict the church, and who but a bad man would persecute religion? It seems as if he had been raised to sovereign eminence at once to rage against God and at once to fall, for having undertaken an expedition against the Carpi, who had then possessed themselves of Dacia and Moesia, he was suddenly surrounded by the barbarians and slain, together with great parts of his army, nor could he be honored with the rites of a sepulchre, but stripped and naked he lay to be devoured by wild beasts and birds, a fit end for the enemy of God. And presently Valerian also, in a mood alike frantic, lifted up his impious hands to assault God, and, although his time was short, shed much righteous blood. But God punished him in a new and extraordinary manner, that it might be a lesson to future ages that the adversaries of heaven always receive the just recompense of their iniquities. He, having been made a prisoner by the Persians, lost not only that power which he had exercised without moderation, but also the liberty of which he had deprived others, and he wasted the remainder of his days in the vilest condition of slavery. For Sepphoris, the king of the Persians, who had made him prisoner, whenever he chose to get into his carriage or to mount on horseback, commanded the Roman to stoop and present his back. Then setting his foot on the shoulders of Valerian, he said, with a smile of reproach, "This is true, and not what the Romans delineate on board or plaster." Valerian lived for a considerable time under the well-merited insults of his conqueror, so that the Roman name remained long the scoff and derision of the barbarians, and this also was added to the severity of his punishment, that although he had an emperor for his son, he found no one to revenge his captivity and most abject and servile state. Neither indeed was he ever demanded back. Afterward, when he had finished this shameful life under so great a disfavor, he was flayed, and his skin, stripped from his flesh, was dyed with vermilion, and placed in the temple of the gods of the barbarians, that the remembrance of a triumph so signal might be perpetuated, and that this spectacle might always be exhibited to our ambassadors, as an admonition to the Romans that, beholding the spoils of their captivated emperor in a Persian temple, they should not place too great confidence in their own strength. Now, since God so punished the sacrilegious, is it not strange that anyone should afterward have dared to, or even devise, aught against the majesty of the one God who governs and supports all things? Aurelian might have recollected the fate of the captivated emperor, yet, being of a nature outrageous and headstrong, he forgot both his sin and his punishment, and by deeds of cruelty irritated the divine wrath. He was not, however, permitted to accomplish what he had devised, for just as he began to give a loose to his rage, he was slain. His bloody edicts had not yet reached the more distant provinces, but he himself lay all bloody on the earth at Cainofurium in Thrace, assassinated by his familiar friends, who had taken up groundless suspicions against him. Examples of such a nature, and so numerous, ought to have deterred succeeding tyrants. Nevertheless, they were not only not dismayed, but in their misdeeds against God became more bold and presumptuous. While Diocletian, that author of ill, and deviser of misery, was ruining all things, he could not withhold his insults, not even against God. This man, by avarice partly, and partly by timid counsels, overturned the Roman Empire, for he made choice of 3 persons to share the government with him, and thus, the empire having been quartered, armies were multiplied, and each of the 4 princes strove to maintain a much more considerable military force than any sole emperor had done in times past. There began to be fewer men who paid taxes than there were who received wages, so that the means of the husbandmen being exhausted by enormous impositions, the farms were abandoned, cultivated grounds became woodland, and universal dismay prevailed. Besides, the provinces were divided into minute portions, and many presidents and a multitude of inferior officers lay heavy on each territory and almost on each city. There were also many stewards of different degrees and deputies of presidents. Very few civil causes came before them, but there were condemnations daily, and forfeitures frequently inflicted, taxes on numberless commodities, and those not only often repeated, but perpetual, and, in exacting them, intolerable wrongs. Whatever was laid on for the maintenance of the soldiery might have been endured, but Diocletian, through his insatiable avarice, would never allow the sums of money in his treasury to be diminished. He was constantly heaping together extraordinary aids and free gifts, that his original hoards might remain untouched and inviolable. He also, when by various extortions he had made all things exceedingly dear, attempted by an ordinance to limit their prices. Then much blood was shed for the various trifles. Men were afraid to expose aught to sale, and the scarcity became more excessive and grievous than ever, until, in the end, the ordinance, after having proved destructive to multitudes, was from mere necessity abrogated. To this there were added a certain endless passion for building, and on that account endless exactions from the provisions for furnishing wages to laborers and artificers, and supplying carriages and whatever else was requisite to the works that he projected. Here public halls, there a circus, here a mint, and there a workhouse for making implements of war. In one place a habitation for his empress, and in another for his daughter. Presently great part of the city was quitted, and all men removed with their wives and children as from a town taken by enemies. And when those buildings were completed to the destruction of the whole provinces, he said, they are not right, let them be done on another plan. Then they were to be pulled down or altered to undergo perhaps a future demolition. By such folly was he continually endeavoring to equal Nicomedia with the city Rome in magnificence. I omit mentioning how many perished on account of their possessions or wealth, for such evils were exceedingly frequent, and through their frequency appeared almost lawful. But this was peculiar to him, that whenever he saw a field remarkably well cultivated, or a house of uncommon elegance, a false accusation and a capital punishment were straightway prepared against the proprietor, so that it seemed as if Diocletian could not be guilty of rapine without also shedding blood. What was the character of his brother in empire, Maximian, called Herculeus, not unlike to that of Diocletian, and indeed to render their friendship so close and faithful as it was, there must have been in them a sameness of inclinations and purposes, a corresponding will, and a unanimity in judgment. Herein alone they were different, that Diocletian was more avaricious and less resolute, and that Maximian, with less avarice, had a bolder spirit, prone not to good, but to evil. For while he possessed Italy, itself the chief seat of the empire, and while other very opulent provinces, such as Africa and Spain, were near at hand, he took little care to preserve those treasures which he had such fair opportunities of amassing. Whenever he stood in need of more, the richest senators were presently charged by suborned evidences as guilty of aspiring to the empire, so that the chief luminaries of the Senate were daily extinguished, and thus the treasury, delighting in blood, overflowed with ill-gotten wealth. Add to all this the incontinency of that pestilent wretch, not only in debauching males, which is hateful and abominable, but also in the violation of the daughters of the principal men of the state, for wherever he journeyed, virgins were suddenly torn from the presence of their parents. In such enormities he placed his supreme delight, and to indulge to the utmost his lust and flagitious desires was in his judgment the felicity of his reign. I pass over Constantius, a prince unlike the others, and worthy to have had the sole government of the empire. But the other Maximian, that is Galerius, chosen by Diocletian for his son-in-law, was worse, not only than those two princes whom our own times have experienced, but worse than all the bad princes of former days. In this wild beast there dwelt a native barbarity and savageness foreign to Roman blood, and a wonder, for his mother was born beyond the Danube, and it was an inroad of the Carpi that obliged her to cross over and take refuge in Nudacia. The form of Galerius corresponded with his manners, of stature tall, full of flesh, and swollen to a horrible bulk of corpulency. By his speech, gestures, and looks, he made himself a terror to all that came near him. His father-in-law, too, dreaded him excessively. The cause was this. Narses, king of the Persians, emulating the example set him by his grandfather Sepphoris, assembled a great army and aimed at becoming master of the eastern provinces of the Roman Empire. Diocletian, apt to be low-spirited and timorous in every commotion, and fearing a fate like that of Valerian, would not in person encounter Narses, but he sent Galerius by the way of Armenia, while he himself halted in eastern provinces and anxiously watched the event. It is a custom among the barbarians to take everything that belongs to them into the field. Galerius laid an ambush for them and easily overthrew men embarrassed with the multitude of their followers and with their baggage. Having put Narses to flight and returned with much spoil, his own pride and Diocletian's fears were greatly increased. For after this victory he rose to such a pitch of haughtiness as to reject the appellation of Caesar. And when he heard that appellation in letters addressed to him, he cried out, with a stern look and terrible voice, "How long am I to be Caesar?" Then he began to act extravagantly, insomuch that, as if he had been a second Romulus, he wished to pass for and to be called the offspring of Mars, and that he might appear the issue of a divinity. He was willing that his mother Romula should be dishonored with the name of adulteress. But not to confound the chronological order of events,
I delay the recital of his actions, for indeed afterward, when Galerius got the title of emperor, his father-in-law having been divested of the imperial purple, he became altogether outrageous and of unbounded arrogance, while by such a conduct and with such associates, Diocles, for that was the name of Diocletian before he attained sovereignty, occupied himself in subverting the commonwealth. There was no evil which his crimes did not deserve. Nevertheless, he reigned most prosperously as long as he forbore to defile his hands with blood of the just. And what cause he had for persecuting them, I come now to explain. Diocletian, as being of a timorous disposition, was a searcher into futurity, and during his abode in the East he began to slay victims, that from their livers he might obtain a prognostic of events. And while he sacrificed, some attendants of his, who were Christians, stood by, and they put the immortal sign on their foreheads. At this the demons were chased away, and the holy rites interrupted. The soothsayers trembled, unable to investigate the wanton marks on the entrails of the victims. They frequently repeated the sacrifices, as if the former had been unpropitious, but the victims, slain from time to time, afforded no tokens for divination. At length Tagis, the chief of the soothsayers, either from guess or from his own observation, said, "There are profane persons here who obstruct the rites." Then Diocletian, in furious passion, ordered not only all who were assisting at the holy ceremonies, but also all who resided within the palace, to sacrifice, and in case of their refusal, to be scourged. And further, by letters to the commanding officers, he enjoined that all soldiers should be forced to do to the like impiety, under pain of being dismissed the service. Thus far his rage proceeded, but at that season he did nothing more against the law and religion of God. After an interval of some time he went to winter in Bithynia, and presently Galerius Caesar came thither, inflamed with furious resentment, and proposing to excite the inconsiderate old man to carry on the persecution which he had begun against the Christians. I have learned that the cause of his fury was as follows. The mother of Galerius, a woman exceedingly superstitious, was a votary of the gods of the mountains. Being of such a character, she made sacrifices almost every day, and she feasted her servants on the meat offered to idols. But the Christians of her family would not partake of those entertainments, and while she feasted with the Gentiles, they continued in fasting and prayer. On this account she conceived ill will against the Christians, and by womanlike complaints instigated her son, no less superstitious than herself, to destroy them. So during the whole winter, Diocletian and Galerius held councils together, at which no one else assisted, and it was the universal opinion that their conferences respected the most momentous affairs of the empire. The old man long opposed the fury of Galerius, and showed how pernicious it would be to raise disturbances throughout the world, and to shed so much blood, that the Christians were wont with eagerness to meet death, and that it would be enough for him to exclude persons of that religion from the court and the army. Yet he could not restrain the madness of that obstinate man. He resolved, therefore, to take the opinion of his friends. Now this was a circumstance in the bad disposition of Diocletian, that whenever he determined to do good, he did it without advice, that the praise might be all his own. But whenever he determined to do ill, which he was sensible would be blamed, he called in many advisers, that his own fault might be imputed to other men. And therefore a few civil magistrates and a few military commanders were admitted to give their counsel, and the question was put to them according to priority of rank. Some, through personal ill will toward the Christians, were of the opinion that they ought to be cut off as enemies of the gods and adversaries of the established religious ceremonies. Others thought differently, but having understood the will of Galerius, they, either from dread of displeasing or from a desire of gratifying him, concurred in the opinion given against the Christians. Yet not even then could the emperor be prevailed upon to yield his assent. He determined above all to consult his gods, and to that end he dispatched a soothsayer to inquire of Apollo at Miletus, whose answer was such as might be expected from an enemy of the divine religion. So Diocletian was drawn over from his purpose, but although he could struggle no longer against his friends, and against Caesar and Apollo, yet still he attempted to observe such moderation as to command the business to be carried through without bloodshed. whereas Galerius would have had all persons burned alive who refused to sacrifice. A fit and auspicious day was sought out for the accomplishment of this undertaking, and the festival of the god Terminus, celebrated on the 7th of calends of March, was chosen, in preference to all others, to terminate, as it were, the Christian religion. That day the harbinger of death arose, first cause of ill and long-enduring woes. Of woes which befell not only the Christians, but the whole earth. When that day dawned, in the 8th consulship of Diocletian and 7th of Maximian, suddenly, while it was yet hardly light, the prefect, together with chief commanders, tribunes, and officers of the treasury, came to the church at Nicomedia, and the gates having been forced open, they searched everywhere for an image of the divinity. The books of the Holy Scriptures were found, and they were committed to the flames. The utensils and furniture of the church were abandoned to pillage. All was rapine, confusion, tumult. That church, situated on rising ground, disputing long whether it ought to be set on fire, was within view of the palace, and Diocletian and Galerius stood, as if on a watchtower, disputing long whether it ought to be set on fire. The sentiment of Diocletian prevailed, who dreaded lest so great a fire being once kindled, some part of the city might be burned, for there were many and large buildings that surrounded the church. Then the Praetorian guards came in battle array with axes and other iron instruments, and having been let loose everywhere, they in a few hours leveled that very lofty evidence with the ground. Next day an edict was published, depriving the Christians of all honors and dignities, ordaining also that, without any distinction of rank or degree, they should be subjected to tortures, and that every suit at law should be received against them, while, on the other hand, they were debarred from being plaintiffs in questions of wrong, adultery, or theft, and finally, that they should neither be capable of freedom nor have right of suffrage. A certain person tore down this edict and cut it in pieces, improperly indeed, but with high spirit, saying in scorn, "These are the triumphs of Goths and Sarmatians." Having been instantly seized and brought to judgment, he was not only tortured, but burned alive in the forms of law, and having displayed admirable patience under suffering, he was consumed to ashes.